Introduction to the Apocalypse. The slogan, "Revolution or Death," is no longer the lyrical expression of consciousness in revolt. Rather, it is the last word of the scientific thought of our century. It applies to the perils facing the species as to the inability of individuals to belong in a society where it is well known that the suicide rate is on the increase. The experts had to admit reluctantly that during May 1968 in France, it fell to almost nil. That spring also vouchsafed us a clear sky, and it did so effortlessly, because a few cars were burnt and the shortage of petrol prevented others from polluting the air. When it rains, when there are clouds of smog over Paris, let us never forget that it is the government's fault. Alienated production makes the smog. Revolution makes the sunshine. Guy Debord, A Sick Planet, 1971. All of us secretly desire for this world to end. The future lasts forever, or at least it used to. The grand illusion of Western civilization has always been the myth of progress, namely that the flow of history would beneficially extend into an infinite future. To our parents, civilization offered houses in the suburbs, computers, and automobiles, and civilization delivered. To the children of these workers, civilization offered life on the moon, artificial intelligence, endless peace, all of which have failed to emerge. While our parents cling to belief that someday the mortgage will be repaid and they can retire in happiness, their lost children know that this is a lie. This world offers nothing to us, no meaningful work, no rest, no future, only fear. Over and over again we find ourselves conditioned like rats by the images of not just our own death, but of total destruction. From the collapse of the World Trade Center to the alien invasion, from the specter of nuclear war to the hole in the ozone layer, and now the melting glaciers, these images ingrain themselves in our very being. These images are nothing more than modern projections of the deep-set fantasy of all, the apocalypse. Today, catastrophic climate change is the image of the apocalypse. Nothing has escaped the touch of humanity, from the deepest oceans to the atmosphere itself. There is little doubt that the carbon emissions caused by human activity may bring about the end of the world as we know it. It's just a matter of listening to the ticking of the doomsday clock as it counts down to the climactic apocalypse. Never before in recorded history has the question of the Earth's survival been so starkly posed. And never before has such news been greeted with such indifference. What is to be done in the face of a crisis so large it dwarfs the imagination? We are left with nothing but a sense of impending doom, a strange depression that keeps us oscillating between hysterical hedonism and sad loneliness. And in the end both responses are merely the two faces of the self-same despair. Those self-appointed to save us from this crisis, the governments, scientists, activists, seem incapable of anything but sloganeering. Clean development, carbon markets, sustainable development, climate justice, ecological reparations, green capitalism. We know in our hearts of hearts that these fantasies give any sensible person as much cold comfort as a stiff drink. Confronted with the real possibility of the apocalypse, the world becomes inverted. To continue as if everything is normal in the present moment is the most refined act of nihilism. This generalized delirium, formerly confined to only a handful of activists, has spread over the last few years to the population at large, and even the state seems a sincere believer in catastrophic climate change. Observe the reaction of the nation-states who, while in endless summits to solve the climate crisis, such as the COP15, continue to build airport after airport, highway after highway, giving industries the remit to emit ever more carbon. The nation-states continue to act as if everything is normal, while at the same time lying through their gritted teeth that we are solving the climate crisis. No one today, not even the children, believe them. Their summits and pledges are mere fiddling while Rome burns. The absurd plots hatched by scientists to avert this coming apocalypse, from putting mirrors into space to pumping water from the bottom of the ocean, have only the virtue of being at least mildly entertaining. There is a distinct air of madness about our rulers, a madness that reminds us only too much of the monarchs of the Ancien regime shortly before their beheading. Yet, what can a single person do? The despair felt when confronted by the reality of climate change is an honest appraisal of disaster, where there is no easy escape. Let us hold this despair close, let it nurture us. Honesty is always the best policy for survival. The apocalypse is upon us. Wild, dark times are rumbling toward us, and the prophet who wishes to write a new apocalypse will have to invent entirely new beasts, and beasts so terrible that the ancient animal symbols of St. John will seem like cooing doves and cupids in comparison. Heinrich Heine, Lutetia, or Paris, 1842. The apocalypse is above all a relationship that we have to our time. The apocalypse is always a singular event in the future, so that while there is a sense of impending doom, there is also strange relief in that things can go on exactly as they are now, perhaps indefinitely. Two minor variations exist. Either that this world will be replaced with a new world, shiny and perfect, or that it will just end simpliciter, with nothing at all to follow. Regardless, all apocalyptic thinking holds that this present world will at some point be utterly destroyed. So there is no reason to care for this world, to preserve it, to sustain it. There are two contradictory attitudes one can take to a world whose days are numbered. The first is to continue a steady course toward the apocalypse, to bring it on with a certain glee. In a world without a future, one can abuse this planet without even a slightest hint of guilt. This vision of the apocalypse justifies the exploitation of ever more carbon by the oil barons and coal lords to maintain the present form of life, and make a quick buck of profit in the process. It is precisely this madness that throws the Christian apocalyptic cults into bed with these fossil fuel magnates. The second attitude is to do everything possible to delay the coming apocalypse. In this case, the state is the only possible savior that can prevent the apocalypse, if not indefinitely, at least for a few more years. Just as any atrocity would be justified by presenting the return of the Antichrist, so the state must restructure the lives of its citizens in order to prevent the apocalypse. Apocalyptic time then places any possibility of change far into the distant future, taking all agency from our lives and giving it to some supernatural or scientific event, so negating the possibility of an all-too-human revolution in the present. The apocalypse may be all too real. If science is the new religion, then the present equivalent of prophets would be scientists, and climate change is their secular apocalypse. It is tempting then to dismiss climate change as mere rhetoric, some sort of collective delusion perhaps propagated for nefarious purposes. Yet science has one supposed crucial advantage over religion. Science consists of hypotheses that may be tested, prove true or false, so that science consists of an always limited and yet constantly growing approximation of reality. Even in this era where mysticism is far more popular than science, merely compare the relative number of books on physics sold as compared to those on astrology in any bookstore, there is a lurking suspicion that science actually does matter. Its hypotheses have resulted in everything from the cure to malaria to unmanned drones in Afghanistan. So there is a cause for concern when scientists themselves begin to speak of the apocalypse like mad prophets. The new hobby of science is predicting, like bean counters, how many years we have left. 50, 20, 10, 5. And as long as the apocalypse is not happening right now, we smile and shrug and continue our daily lives. All signs indicate that the apocalypse is underway right at this moment. Not an event in some distant future, The sudden reality of the apocalypse is not to be doubted by anyone who has any protracted connection to the planet, from gardeners to nomads. Only in the cocoon-like and concrete metropolis, where any connection to the vast array of non-human life has been sundered long ago, can anyone fail to notice that the natural world is in a state of advanced destruction. Our society claimed to be possessed of miraculous powers. These miracles have become perverse. The fish have left the seas. Soon the North Sea will be devoid of cod, as the warming oceans devastate the plankton, which are their main food source. Fertile land becomes desert. The emptying of the vast Ogallala aquifer, the tremendous heat waves in France, the fires in Greece. To dream of milk and honey in this age is absurd. The honeybees have disappeared, leaving their hives empty and threatening the reproduction even of the flowers. Even our breast milk is full of toxins. Our ancestors would be shocked beyond belief that it took so little time to make the world not only unbearable, but also uninhabitable. For those who can remember that our planet lives not only in political history, but in geological time, a wave of massive extinctions has commenced, aptly named the Anthropocene extinction event. Nearly half of all species may be gone within the coming decades. Perhaps therein lies the source of a vague feeling of guilt and an inability to even appreciate other species except as cartoons or in cages. The only comparable extinction event in fossil record is the Permian-Triassic extinction event of nearly 250 million years ago, in which nearly all sea life died and 3/4 of animals on land. The cause of the earlier Great Dying in the Permian-Triassic extinction event is almost certainly global warming of between 5 and 6 degrees. Great volcanic eruptions in Siberia released huge amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the air, resulting in a warming that led to the release of even more dangerous methane trapped in ice, a gas 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. This wiped out almost all life in the oceans and nearly all life on land. There is perpetual fear that we will soon encounter positive feedback cycles. Events like the destruction of the Brazilian and African rainforests that will cause an inexorable skyrocketing of carbon emissions, making catastrophic climate change inevitable. Due to climate change, already we are seeing evidence that the permafrost in Siberia is melting in an area the size of France and Germany combined, and billions of tons of methane may soon be released, a tipping point straight into extinction. There is without a doubt something religious to these convictions, with reports on melting glaciers being the equivalent to fiery sermons and carbon offsetting being nothing more than indulgences. The apocalypse is at this historical moment a very real extinction event. It is a particular biological extinction event conjoined with what can only be termed a religious understanding of time, an apocalyptic vision that was long held in check by the Enlightenment. To separate these two distinct phenomena, we can call the real wave of extinctions caused by extreme ecological degradation the biocrisis, while we should reserve the apocalypse for the imagined possibility of the end of the world. The biocrisis is the true in the moment of the apocalypse false, with science itself turned from the secular savior to the creator of the atom bomb. The hope for a bright tomorrow is objectively insane. All we can hope for is some definite end to the situation. Everyone knows the task of our generation is the overthrow of the existing order. Yet like the early Christians describing the end of feudalism in religious rather than political language, our generation is unable to express the obvious necessity of revolution in any more than the scientific language of the catastrophic climate change. The closest parallel to our era, then, is the peasant wars of the late Middle Ages, where the peasant insurrectionists phrased what was fundamentally the desire for a social revolution in religious terms. Perhaps then it is not without a sense of irony that a climate camp to reduce carbon emissions seized Blackheath, where centuries earlier Wat Tyler and an insurrectionary army of peasants nearly overthrew the English monarchy, the first of modern failed revolutions. As Engels noted, it would take centuries for a revolutionary language to be created that could phrase the struggle of beggar kings and heretic priests like Thomas Müntzer for omnia est communia, for everything to be held in common, to be phrased in a way that could be understood without God. The first step in overthrowing the present order is no different, to formulate a new political language of insurrection from the scientific language of catastrophic climate change. Of markets and carbon markets. It seems to be easier for us today to imagine the thoroughgoing deterioration of the earth and of nature than the breakdown of late capitalism. Perhaps that is due to some weakness in our imaginations. Frederick Jameson, The Seed of Time, 1994. The apocalypse is not happening in the future. It is happening now. It is not the result of our personal sins, and it is not the collective responsibility of humanity. Climate change, or God, or whatever, will not bring about the apocalypse. The apocalypse began with the advent of our current form of life based on industrial production. It is easy to assume that there is no alternative to this form of life, that the way we live in this present moment is simply a reflection of the way things are. Implicit in this common sense is the not-so-hidden assumption that the present will extend indefinitely into the future, which both provides a measure of comfort as well as a feeling of imprisonment. In times of crisis, a space of freedom returns, and the possibility of a rupture with the present opens. History, long banished to dreary scholastic books, returns to us fresh and alive. To push away that which is closest to us, our very form of life, and see it objectively, this might seem impossible. Yet it is not. The first step is to give our form of life a name, to identify it as something finite in time and space, so capable of ending. This perpetual present that has its only favor being the certainty of its own destruction has a name: capitalism. Capitalism is based on an equation so simple a child could understand it. Technology plus human labor plus natural resources creates commodities. These commodities can be either more technology for production, otherwise known as capital, or commodities for consumption. The iron law of value states that everything may become a commodity to be exchanged for some value, and value is incarnated as monetary price. Commodities are exchanged not to fulfill human needs, but to accumulate more value. The flow of commodities produces flows of carbon as a trivial side effect of industrial production, and hence the destruction of our entire ecosystem is built into the logic of capitalism. The constantly decreasing term in our equation is the finite natural resources of our planet, which taken to their wild, asymptomatic end spells the real possible extinction of the vast majority of currently existing forms of life. Capitalism is a relationship based on force and class division. For capitalism to continue, the vast majority of humanity must sell our time producing more wealth for the capitalist bourgeoisie. The vast majority of humanity has no option but to sell its labor upon the market in return for commodities to help them survive. The proletariat, the working class in its broadest sense, includes the vast amounts of excluded and unemployed, who stand as a reserve army of labor, that are not necessarily actually at work, and so consist of everyone who has nothing except their time to sell. The bourgeoisie, also called capitalists or owning classes, are those that own capital. Capitalism tends to go hand in hand with private property, as all of these commodities, resources, and capital are private property owned by an individual, corporation, or even the state. The inescapable logic of capitalism is then to colonize every sphere of life, assigning that which was held in common both a private owner and value. This double operation must take place so that this newly valued commodity can be exchanged on the market in order to produce more profit for its owner, and hence expand value and capitalism. As capitalism has now encompassed the entire globe, it needs new kinds of commodities. Even the most immaterial components of life, from our genes to our future via insurance, can be given a price. There seems to be possibly infinite commodities. These are so-called immaterial commodities in the form of code, emotions, and knowledge itself. The inconvenient truth is that even the most immaterial of commodities, such as the internet or intellectual property, rests upon a firmly material foundation, currently the foundation of oil-based products such as food, plastic, computers. Climate change is just symptomatic of capitalism reaching the limits of its expansion in the world of natural resources that evolved before capitalism. It is then fitting that a totalizing crisis like climate change accompanies a totalizing system of production like capitalism. Climate change is just symptomatic of capitalism reaching the limits of its expansion in the world of natural resources that evolved before capitalism. It is then fitting that a totalizing crisis like climate change accompanies a totalizing system of production like capitalism. Carbon emissions are the byproduct of capitalism, just as defecation is the byproduct of humans eating. As fossil fuel-intensive energies are the primary source of cheap energy that capitalism harnesses for production. Yet even stopping carbon emissions would not halt the totalizing biocrisis brought on by capitalism. Carbon emission and climate change are the mere symptoms of the ecological degradation caused by capitalism. Taken as an isolated issue in and of itself, climate change is ludicrous. Even if burning fossil fuels didn't cause climate change, it would still be cancerous to humans, pollute the ocean and the atmosphere, fueling death-dealing automobiles and missiles, creating the raw materials of everything from disposable plastic bags to useless toys. Just as cutting down the forest reduces the planet's ability to store carbon, it also destroys uncountable species, ripping asunder indigenous forms of life and evicting them from their homes, and destroying even the possibility of the joy many humans get from being outside. While a green zero-carbon capitalism may be possible, if implausible, even a zero-carbon capitalism inexorably transforms living natural resources into dead capital. If it's not production of carbon, it will be the destruction of water, of the soil, of lives of the poor, all sacrificed to the ravenous appetite of capital for the production of commodities, even if it means the end of the reproduction of life. Capitalism is the origin of the biocrisis, the last and final crisis of capitalism. The logic of crisis is the logic of capitalism, and capitalism has been in a state of crisis for decades, although it has only become self-evident in the financial crisis of 2008. By far the most productive social system the world has ever seen, capitalism overproduces, leading to an overaccumulation of capital. In any social system shaped around the survival of humanity in the world, this would be viewed as a miracle. The hungry could be fed, the homeless housed, and the creativity of humanity unfettered by mere material concerns. Yet, by the perverse logic of capital, this overproductivity is a crisis. It is increasingly harder to make a profit when more and more commodities are made cheaper and cheaper, and workers are paid less and less. The only way out of crisis is through either a war that destroys capital, the world wars being the obvious solution to the Great Depression, or by some act of black magic to invent a new market of commodities. As total war is viewed as suicidal in the nuclear era, the giant lie of debt and financial markets were created to save capital from crisis in the 1970s and 1980s. With the labor movement destroyed by Thatcher and Reagan, a process globalized through the IMF, the WTO, and the other instruments of neoliberal capitalism, the social peace that followed World War II was terminated. The left reacted in a moralistic horror, but only stood mouth agape as the social solidarity of the workers' world was destroyed, replaced with precarity and the cult of self-interested individualism. The replacement for the wage was debt, money one could spend, but that one had to pay back, literally binding the once rebellious poor to the infinite continuation of capitalism. Debt is the perfect commodity, and the future itself became the new market. The financial market was born, ushering in the era of postmodernism. It is into this world that we are born, a world of skyscrapers and monstrous megamalls, whose towering glass exteriors show that this world was not built for humans, but for the monstrous and inhuman subjectivity of capital. Even with a map, it is impossible not to get lost in Metropolis. And the option of war has not been taken off the table. Far from it. The postmodern world is a world of continual police operations. Instead of a purely military war, a social war that encompasses all of daily life is waged against the population. Wars against drugs, against immigration, against political dissent, against terrorism. Politicians can move from the war on terrorism to the war against climate change without skipping a beat. As the space of the world was bound tighter to financial capital via the spectacular technology of cybernetic networks, all sense of the past evaporated into an ever-present now of instant satisfaction. As no one knows how to actually value debt, a wild cornucopia of highly profitable measures arose. Markets for risk, derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps. The value of the financial system grew to an astounding 4 times the real productivity of capital. Furthermore, the very concept of debt has as its implicit promise that the future must be an eternally frozen version of the present, as debt is a claim on the materialization of future profits. As it became evident that the poor could ever pay back such massive debt, the age of financial capitalism and its secret religion of the free market ended. No one believed in the banks and they collapsed, just as the pagan temples of ancient Greece fell into the ruins when no one believed in Zeus any longer. The banks themselves did not even know how much money was worth, and no one trusted the state to fix this crisis of value. The British Chancellor said that it was his word that the savings of the people would be protected, but there was long lines outside of banks nonetheless. How could anyone trust the government that had claimed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Only an event of nearly divine proportions can resurrect the belief in capital in the state, and luckily there is a miracle: the advent of catastrophic climate change. From Greenpeace to Obama, the solution everyone touts to climate change is, unsurprisingly, the expansion of capitalism into the very atmosphere via carbon trading. By government's decree at summits like the COP process of the United Nations, carbon is assigned to a monetary value, and then exchanging carbon on a market, carbon emissions are supposed to decrease. However, this contradicts all past experience and the axioms of capital itself. The creation of yet another market will undoubtedly lead to more capitalist production and so accelerate ecological degradation. While capitalism has figured out how to assign values to simple material necessities like shoes and coal, the price of carbon will simply be made out of thin air. The resemblances to the pricing of risk on financial markets to the pricing of carbon on carbon markets are almost all too clear. Such an ability to assign adequate value is a recipe for a boom of rampant fraud and speculation, followed by a resounding crash. A carbon market is just like the financial market, as the failure of the European Union's emission trading system, later a part of the Kyoto Protocol, has already demonstrated in spades. Carbon markets require more production, and so more carbon, which in turn signs the collective death sentence of the biocrisis. How does one assign a price for carbon? How can one give the continued existence of human life as we know it a monetary value? The market demands such questions be answered. To burn a car dealership to the ground is more ecologically sustainable than carbon trading. It is precisely the creation and flow of commodities that threatens the future of life on this planet. Sabotage the carbon flows. For years, decades, we have pleaded and petitioned those in power, those responsible for injustice, genocide, and ecocide. This pleading has gone unanswered. It is time to use actions that cannot be ignored. Jeffrey Lewis on Sabotage, 2001. Far into the horizon, the coal moves endlessly down the conveyor belt, from open-cast coal mine to the smokestacks of the power plant. In Glengart, suddenly there is a break, a rupture, something almost unheard of. Sabotage. The belt has been cut. The coal tumbles to the ground. Sabotage is the elementary form of resistance to capitalism, and so sabotage is simultaneously the elementary form of preventing catastrophic climate change. Sabotage is a generalized phenomenon. Everyone is doing it. Who doesn't hate their job? As capitalism tries to squeeze ever more productivity out of people, workers themselves attempt to self-manage, perhaps by reading 7 Habits of Highly Effective People or other self-help books, blaming themselves for their persistent depression. More often, workers go insane, and if wealthy, will end up in psychiatrist offices, and if not, homeless on the street. No one can work all the time unless they somehow self-manage themselves into becoming part and parcel of capital itself. In response to the frantic pace of capitalism, there is the proliferation of everyday resistance to capitalist productivity. This can take 2 forms. First, that of individual acts of resistance or survival, taking sick days from work, sleeping in, stealing, fake benefit claims, the sabotage of equipment. The second form, that of collective action through strikes or occupations, is more dangerous to capitalism's maintenance. As such, the state and the capitalist-owning class have developed tactics to deal with such threats. These can take forms ranging from the police club to the scab union official. A limited and controlled amount of sabotage is the grease behind the wheels of the capitalist machine. A small amount of stolen time for tobacco breaks is tolerated, as is the use of computers for checking personal emails and playing video games in offices. These activities are not clamped down either because they are not noticed or because truly wise managers realize this small amount of sabotage is necessary to prevent the working class from going insane at work. To give the worker at least some minor level of autonomy is necessary for the smooth operation of the entire machine. To offload coal from a train to the power plant on a conveyor belt, the worker must actively involve himself in making certain that the coal is offloaded at a uniform speed, to personally deal with any disruptions and irregularities in a way that a mere robot would be incapable of doing. If for some reason the train is late, the worker can wait patiently. If the conveyor belt stops, the worker can also stop and investigate the reason. However, this autonomy can always be used against capitalist production itself. From this potential is the long tradition of worker sabotage that has always been the scourge of capitalism. For example, workers in the USA once put empty beer cans inside the hollow spaces of automobile doors, so that as soon as they hit the highway the cars made noises, forcing the recall of thousands of vehicles and a tremendous loss of profit. This is what a small act at the heart of production can do. Imagine what small acts at the sensitive heart of the carbon-emitting infrastructure could do. Sabotage is any act that destroys the reproduction of capitalism. The individual, as worker, is the basic unit of the reproduction of capitalism, and this worker can mutate out of the confines of capitalism into something entirely new, a potential saboteur, a Luddite for the 21st century. One can even consider dropping out of school or a career, and therefore wasting the considerable investment made in a person by society, to be a form of life of sabotage. Even generalized depression will lead to sabotage, as one becomes a bad employee or simply fails to turn up to work. The problem is not the lack of small acts of sabotage. The problem is to increase their intensity and organization to a point where the flows of commodities, and so carbon, are blocked. This will require a new kind of mass sabotage, a new kind of strike, the human strike. There is a constant tension between protest and sabotage that goes under the term direct action. The thesis of the protest is always that if the masses were only told by placard-waving activists about the disastrous state of the world, then they would rise up and force things to change. However, people outside activism already realize the dire state of affairs. Most people find it easier to push it out of their minds rather than march in endless circles with signs, correctly realizing that the protest is an ineffective tactic. Protest merely asks the powers that be of capital and the state to politely stop. Millions tried this to stop the Iraq War in 2003 to no effect. The difference between protest and sabotage comes down to the following maxim. The point is not to ask for something to stop, but to make it stop. In this vein, a movement towards direct action emerges. This motto of direct action in terms of climate change has mostly been taken up by the climate camp movement originating from the United Kingdom. The climate camps, while effective at raising awareness of different forms of life, have proved to be ineffective themselves at actually halting carbon-intensive infrastructure via direct action. This is not to say that their spectacular influence via the media has not had an effect, for surely it has been one of the factors that prevented a third runway in Heathrow Airport from being built, or a new coal-burning power plant at King's North not to be constructed. To be clear, the climate camps have failed at the task of stopping the flows of carbon via direct action without mediation. At best, the workers themselves shut down the infrastructure for the announced day of action. Shutting down a coal-burning plant here, stopping an airport expansion there, halting some carbon emissions for a day. These are all concessions the state will more than happily give as long as overall the flows of carbon and commodities are not threatened. Eventually, any strategy based on media manipulation will reach its limits. To shut down every coal-burning power plant, while necessary to halt catastrophic climate change, would be a catastrophe for the economy. The failures of mass direct action by the climate camps have a silver lining. For a truly successful direct action on carbon-intensive infrastructures like the Heathrow Airport in London or the King's North coal-burning power plant in Kent would bring down an iron fist of repression far greater than any yet seen by protest. The state finds that an attempt to shut down infrastructure critical to the maintenance of global capitalism, like power plants and airports, is far more danger to capitalism than street parties and summit mobilizations. The irony of the situation is that despite the fact that protests against catastrophic climate change are primarily symbolic, to halt climate change is far from symbolic. The question is not what to do, but how. While these camps and mass protests are useful as educational battlegrounds, they cannot in general succeed in halting the flows of carbon directly. As the police raid on the King's North camp showed, the territory of the climate camps almost always puts direct action at a disadvantage. It is just difficult to mount a successful mass direct action in a field, isolated in the middle of nowhere surrounded by police and cameras with only a few rather obvious targets nearby. The climate camps suffered from the picture thinking. Being unable to grasp the totality of capitalism as a source of climate change, climate camps resort to only concrete targets that are obviously emitting carbon, leading to the likely recuperation of these direct actions by green capitalism. Creativity should be called for, as coal-burning factories with large smokestacks and airplanes with huge combustion engines are not the only source of carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are the byproduct of the very flows of global capital itself, and the infrastructure of the state that maintains it, and these flows can be blockaded, stopped, and shut down. To stop pollution in an era in which the entire world has become a factory, all one has to do is choose a date and a target, where the situation is to the advantage. The choice of targets often comes down to what resonates and what one can get away with. The actual methods include anything considered suitable, and violence never need to be employed. Both blockades and sabotage of industrial production are strangely non-violent. Whilst any attempts to actually storm the coal-burning power plants of King's North and Drax to shut them down failed, a train line holding coal was blocked by an act of civil disobedience in 2008. If the protesters in the UK could learn from the decades-old movement of the anti-Castor Autonomen in Germany, then they would realize the multitudes of ways to paralyze a train full of coal that does not even involve arrests. The most successful sabotages do not only directly and without mediation halt production, but choose targets that provoke popular sympathy. These targets need no communique, By their very nature, they are impossible to ignore. The sabotage of coal transfer lines in Glentaughart, carried out at the Scottish climate camp, serves as a prime example. For years, the devastated mining community of Douglas had been fighting the creation of another strip mine. Climate activists set up a tree sit-in in order to prevent the expansion of the strip mining and were given food and support by the locals. Even the police were sympathetic. When it was realized that kilometers upon kilometers of conveyor belts transporting coal across Scotland could be easily destroyed with a single cut, they were. Where decades of protest had failed, a single act of sabotage had succeeded, albeit momentarily. To block the flows, sabotage must move from moments to sustained duration. Sabotage at the heart of production with the complicity of the workers themselves could return. Look at the widespread strikes, boss snappings, and threatened explosions by workers in France today, where they do not want to return to work, to be a worker, but want immediate abolition of their own role within capital, which they concretely see as possible via large payoffs. On the other hand, watch how the anti-globalization and radical ecological movements have transformed into a movement to stop climate change. Imagine if these two tendencies combined, as they came close to at the Vestas occupation. Who else knows how to halt the flows better than the workers themselves? 1 million people in the streets could not halt the Iraq War, but dock workers could easily halt arms shipments. The spread of sabotage as an offensive in the generalized social war is the most promising terrain of struggle against capitalism. The vast majority of people may not show up to a demonstration, but it does not mean that they are insensible to the dizzying social and economic disintegration of capital. Their cynicism only proves only they are better tacticians than the self-described activists. Yet in a future of declining natural resources and crisis, increasingly large swaths of the population will want a way out. Without a doubt, those who fight today will be the children of the last generation to truly believe in capitalism. For the youth today have no hope. If a few dying old men want to bring apocalypse, their children must bring on the insurrection. Perhaps their children will meet at night covered in black masks, or perhaps these newborn saboteurs will operate in broad daylight. Flight attendants and construction workers, students and baristas, junior accountants. The question is no longer one of theory but of practice. How to blockade the flows of capitalism as to halt ecological degradation and human exploitation. It may end with generalized social war, but it begins with groups of friends. Hand in hand, bands of friends can coordinate to halt the flow of commodities and carbon, flexing their muscle, perhaps just first for an hour, then a day, then a month, the goal forever. After the coal line is sabotaged in Glentaughart, the locals from the town of Douglas who have been resisting the open cast coal mine visited the Scottish climate camp. The villagers wanted to express their concern. The coal is now moved onto trucks through their village illegally. Yet since when has capitalism ever cared for the legality when profit is at stake? The villagers were worried that the media would paint them all as saboteurs and so put back their struggle against the open cast coal mine. Perhaps the sabotage went too far. The reality of the matter is obvious. The sabotage did not go far enough. The spectacle of green capitalism. As long as there is man and environment, the police will be there between them. Anonymous, The Coming Insurrection, 2006. It must be an almost religious force that keeps the people enthralled to capitalism. The board calls this force the spectacle. The advertisements, television, blogs, websites, video games. That is nothing more than the collection of images that serve as the revealed religion of capital. Sartre remarks that he had never seen perfection until he had seen a movie. The world of advertisements is to us as central as the world of Christ and his angels was to our medieval ancestors. The spectacle is when the relationships between humans become mediated not just through commodities, but images produced by capital. As capital overaccumulates to ever more absurd heights, in the search for more markets, capital colonizes the very social life of humans. Capitalism is to colonize the totality of our social life precisely to the extent it is able to capitalize any other form of life. One step of this colonization was depriving the multitude of their traditional form of life in order to put them to work in factories. Yet somehow, after work, workers rejoiced and, shedding their workday clothes, became human again, playing music in the bar, dreaming in the park, laying in each other's arms. In order to extract perpetually more profit, there became ever longer hours and ever more perfected assembly lines, with a global division of labor that undermines traditional factory organizing. However, eventually a limit is reached in classical capitalism. To continue the production of endless commodities, capitalism must colonize all of human time and culture. A new and terrible prison of the imagination is imposed upon people via the perfect image of the commodity, transmitted electrically around the world via the mass media. These images of commodities direct our collective human activity, so that our relationships become commodities themselves, the sickening appearance of social capital. This global collection of disjointed images of commodities and superstars then becomes the abstract unity that binds the fragmented humanity together, masking the very real divisions of power and wealth. For decades, capitalism produced only the spectacle of its own perfectibility in the form of sexy young people consuming shiny new things eternally, but always leaving out the images of its own waste. All the obvious causes and results of capitalism were artfully hidden, from the millions of pounds of plastic in the oceans to the endless acres of forest reduced to stumps. As the process of natural resource extraction cannot continue infinitely on a finite planet without some physical side effects that will eventually wake even the most hypnotized of workers from their spectacular slumber, the spectacle can no longer present itself as images of heaven on earth. The happiness promised by commodities is transformed into terror. The dream of capital becomes its nightmare, the image of the apocalypse. In the era of the apocalypse, the spectacle must invert itself. In the analysis of Debord, the spectacle as a collection of images was the summit of industrial capitalism, the symbol of its total power. As a new and very material reconfiguration of capitalism is in order, the first step is the transformation of the images of the spectacle. Images of the apocalypse are endlessly repeated in movies starring Al Gore, in the pleas of scientists, and the last of polar bears hanging desperately on to the final melting iceberg. When produced by capitalism, these images are not innocent reflections of reality, but instead signal a conscious manipulation of our inner lives in order to make us willing slaves to transformation of late capitalism into green capitalism. Even if due to the bio-crisis, some measure of alarm is justified. Green capitalism is merely a spectacular form of capitalism that denies its own role in the consumption of natural resources. The image of green capitalism as a latter-day technological messiah that must rescue a powerless humanity from the apocalypse produces again only an unreal unity that masks the real divisions between those who benefit and the vast majority of the world that suffers from ecological degradation. A Greenpeace ad in the New York Times said, "It wasn't the Exxon Valdez captain's driving that caused the Alaskan oil spill. It was yours." Any desire for a genuinely social revolution is transferred to the ascetic self-management of the individual, the care of the self. Remember that self-management is still nothing more than management, with a tinge of self-righteousness puritanism. Only the righteous will be saved, and your individual carbon emissions are a perfect way of measuring your sins. Google has even commenced the production of devices to allow self-management of personal electricity consumption and, no doubt, soon, carbon emissions. True salvation is now being carbon neutral, or more realistically, a 50% carbon reduction, a 65% reduction, an 85% reduction. These goals employ all the fanaticism of fad diets and flagellation. Of course, this perfectly alienated solution to climate change ignores the obvious contradiction that a single individual reducing their personal carbon emissions has little to no effect. For example, unplugging your phone charger only reduces your personal energy consumption by 1/100th of 1% at most. A more sinister agenda is at work. The world's population is so vast, so huge, that it is even inconceivable to imagine policing this multitude to coerce them into green capitalism. The new slaves must enter into green capitalism willingly, and must police themselves, cleansing themselves of all impure thoughts of communism and violence. These thoughts are taken to be the result of some neurochemical disorder or childhood trauma. Green capitalism must refuse to admit, under all circumstances, that our mode of production is responsible for carbon emissions, since from that terrible hypothesis would come the obvious conclusion that such an edifice must be overthrown, and that those who benefit from it, the planetary bourgeoisie, are those who have truly caused the catastrophe of climate change. They try to escape by placing the blame on a collective humanity who have harnessed industrial production for their common needs at the expense of the environment, ignoring the historical reality that climate change is being precipitated not by humanity as a whole, the vast majority of which was dragged kicking and screaming into the factories and sweatshops, but by capitalism, married as it is to industrial production. Indeed, carbon emissions and climate change more than clearly reveal what can only be called a class divide. The carbon emissions of a jet-setting businessman from either Britain or Qatar outstrip those of the thousands of unemployed from the United States to Guatemala that have been excluded from the planetary bourgeoisie, or those workers enslaved by the self-same planetary bourgeoisie in the vast factories in China and Brazil. Whilst the social peace of the last 50 years in Europe and the United States seemed to make the division between classes disappear, so that the working class thought itself a part of the bourgeoisie, for example by partaking in the financial markets, and the bourgeoisie simply pretended it did not exist, in an era of declining natural resources it would be surprising not to see a return of class hatred. Unless, of course, green capitalism can, via the image of the apocalypse, convince everyone that we're all in this together. Never is capitalist production itself to be questioned. Far from it. A whole new market of green commodities is produced for a profit. Everything from electric cars to fair trade and carbon-neutral lattes, whose production only worsens the real crisis of natural resources while stroking the egos of a new green bourgeoisie who can afford such precious green products as the rest of the world descends into food riots. Green restaurants, green airports, green banks, soon enough there will be lead-free green bullets and green torture chambers. Climate change only produces a whole new round of profit for everyone, from professional activists from Greenpeace, climate change scientists, greenwashing advertising companies, and now the very state itself. With every prophecy of the coming apocalypse, there is a ring at the cash register by green capitalism. Green capitalism institutionalizes the apocalypse rather than escaping it. Those who would call to the state to find a solution, solutions which would include further taxation on the working class and poor in the form of carbon credits and other measures of green austerity, will only lead to increased state control over our daily lives. These calls will only be used to consolidate state power and secure the profitability of capital, whether the technologies it employs are green or not. It is ridiculous to beg for the capitalist management of a crisis that capitalism itself created. The solutions of green capitalism, when inspected under the light of science, are science fiction. Sustainable energy just doesn't add up. To give the standard of living of the planetary bourgeoisie to the rest of the world is mathematically impossible on sustainable energy, as anyone with a basic knowledge of arithmetic can determine. Even if all of Africa was covered in biofuel-producing plants like jatropha, we would only cover a third of our current oil consumption.
This is even without considering that biofuels transform desperately needed land for growing food into land for producing biofuels. Wind, geothermal, tidal energy, even if exploited to their maximum via currently non-existent global facilities, cannot even cover a third of current consumption. To reduce carbon emissions by planting trees would even require nation-state sized tree plantations, which are impossible given population constraints. The bottom line is clear. Sustainable energy requires both massive solar farms in other people's deserts, and even then, it will require the restarting of nuclear power. The obvious motor of any carbon-free economy will be uranium. Or just keep mining and burning coal. Luckily for those who are afraid of strikes, mines for coal can be reopened, yet without workers. Mountaintop removal, destroying mountains older than humanity by sheer explosives that leaves only a lunar landscape behind in order to retrieve coal, is accelerating, replacing the traditional mining communities and their world. Complete fabrications like carbon capture, otherwise known as the eminently paradoxical clean coal, will be the green herrings dangled in front of the population as the use of fossil fuels accelerates. Carbon capture requires a considerable amount of energy produced to power the technology to capture the carbon. Where is that energy supposed to come from? We emit carbon, so we eventually emit less. We destroy the planet in order to save it. The reign of the green spectacle turns this paradox into gospel. Green capitalism is green colonialism, albeit more confused as the distinctions between the global north and the global south dissolve as what the colonial British called the colored empires of India and China today compete directly with the traditional colonial west for natural resources. China is buying tremendous swaths of Africa, and the United States is creating military bases near every bastion of oil, whilst plans have started for massive solar panel farms in northern Africa to ship electricity straight to Europe. Green capitalism is nothing but a strangely postmodern green colonialism. The reason for this game is not just a lack of energy sources, as there is no shortage of coal and the ever-increasing prospects of oil shortage. The reason is much more deadly, for climate change is expected to lead to a sharp decline in food production as the world population grows to nearly 9 billion. Follow the money. The large investments of green capitalism are to construct new border fortifications, the present day of equivalent of Hadrian's Wall, to stop the flow of climate refugees whose numbers are sure to mount. We don't need a climatologist to tell us which way the wind is blowing. This new era of capitalism will not be heralded by a military war, but by a generalized low-intensity conflict that encompasses the totality of life, the global social war. Increased police violence, constant surveillance, RFID chips, and biometric identity cards are tactical operations in a war of capital against the enemy within, ever so easily exemplified by anarchists, unemployed youth, and immigrants. As this social war becomes ever more mundane, climate change will force wartime measures upon every citizen. Carbon emissions limits and trading will be excuses for new austerity measures to inflict upon the poor. Green technology will maintain the bourgeoisie form of life even inside the most privileged of countries, whilst the rest of the world must be left to starve to death. Every metropolis will be divided into a green zone for the planetary eco-bourgeoisie and vast swaths of exclusion for the new proletariat. The contrast between the cafes outside Notre Dame and the excluded banlieues is not the exception. This contrast is the foundation for the model of the city of the future, and in this regard the riots of Paris in 2005 are the most normal of responses to this new urbanism. These riots were only a sneak preview of the future, for the first effects of the catastrophic climate change will be food riots and mass migrations as the waters rise and the degrees creep irreversibly into arable land. Only the most massive of psychological and spectacular operations, green capitalism, can save capitalism from this crisis of its own making. If you don't want to assist in the spectacle of the end of the world, you must work toward ending the world of the spectacle. The myth of democracy. How true that the most practical people are often the most naive utopians. Enrico Malatesta, The Anarchist in the Present Time, 1930. In order for the machinery of this envisioned green capitalism to work, it is vital that everyone actively participate in generalized self-management in order to stop carbon emissions. Who should we blame for carbon emissions? The corporation that makes them? The nation that the corporation is in? A mode of transport between countries, its consumers? It's obvious. In spite of the spectacle of green capitalism, the totality of the circuit of consumption and production must be halted to stop climate change. Utopian plans that sketch in detail precisely how carbon market can result in a low-carbon world, from Kyoto 2 to contraction and convergence, never confront the self-evident truth that their plans only require more than ever an all-powerful state, a state we can believe in. The state uses the rhetoric of democracy to justify its existence, for democracy denies the very real class tensions that will be exacerbated by climate change-induced food riots. Activists who call for a more democratic mechanism for constraining carbon emissions serve merely as the vanguard of capitalism itself. Whilst in the era of neoliberalism, the call for democracy may have been the most radical of gestures, in the area of climate change, the demand for democratic self-management is the new ideology of capital, as capitalism realizes the only way to prevent an increasingly obvious class conflict is to have everyone believe we are all in it together. How old-fashioned the demands of the alter globalization movement appear in this new era, just as the red flag itself appeared hopelessly out of date in 1999. Less coal, more democracy, these most conservative of revolutionaries beg. If only the indigenous people were represented, the women, the poor. Let us pretend that everyone could have their voices heard in the most massive of summits, with no material force to compel an actual change in our form of life. Even the most well-intentioned will find themselves accomplices to the next round of green capitalist restructuring. Do not forget that the institutions of neoliberal capitalism were more than happy to give the NGOs in developing world a seat at the table of the World Bank. This is precisely how the radical Democrats of the alter globalization movement were defeated. The G8 is dead. Long live the G20. A few more people of color at the table aren't going to halt the march towards green capitalism, let alone halt the biocrisis. Barack Obama, Gordon Brown, Bono, Bill Gates, and all the rest would be more than happy to sit down and have a latte with the representatives of the Global South, as long as they can get a good photo shoot and be quoted in the newspaper as saying, "I feel your pain." During a food crisis, one does not sit at the table and beg for crumbs from the plates of the rich. Demand nothing, instead occupy everything and blockade the flows. Forget the NGOs who represent the Global South. They are basically a jet-setting elite of professional representatives that exist to balm the soul of capitalism, and so to soften the very real colonization of the Global South. A far better representative would be the people from Papua New Guinea, who, when delivered medical supplies by British activists, asked and said for guns. To declare oneself to be against democracy is akin to declaring oneself fit for a mental asylum, even in the most radical of social circles, despite the fact that the primary obstacle to a social revolution against capitalism is representative democracy itself. Historically, social revolution is ignited via the gathered intensity of a minority that takes action into their own hands, not waiting for a vote or consensus. From the Paris Commune to St. Petersburg, almost every revolution has only had 1 out of 100 people on the streets, with Tehran in 1979 having 1 in 10 people in the streets. One does not wait for permission to act, one acts, with those who are willing, and then, if the act is taken at the right time, the action may then generalize. Historically, waiting for a vote has been the enemy of revolution. De Gaulle defeated the unrest in May 1968 by calling an election. It is not an accident that democracy and capitalism have since their historical inception been joined at the hip, declared by Fukuyama to be the best of all possible flavors of governance. While it is certain that capitalism can continue under many possible governmental forms, Chinese authoritarianism and the faded remnants of European social democracy leap to mind, this is not to deny that there is certain attachment of capitalism to representative democracy. Capitalism and democracy mirror within each other the same abstract law of value. Democracy is the great equalizer of politics, in which every individual is the same, just as the market is the great equalizer on which every commodity is the same, just as every absurd thing from plastic baubles to carbon can be bought and sold on the market. Every possible mundane issue can be voted for and ratified, from the placement of traffic signals to a proportion of carbon states will be allowed to emit. Would a vote on the collective destruction of vast swaths of humanity somehow justify it? Capitalism reduces all things, even imaginary and invisible things, to the same abstract form of the commodity, with an owner and a price. Democracy does the exact same operation on the political sphere, as it reduces all of us to abstract individuals with the ability to express our opinion through voting. Even consensus can devolve from the creation of a new collective thoughts in common to a mere process, an extreme form of democratic voting where everyone is compelled to agree. Capitalism and democracy pretend to separate the sphere of politics from that of the economy, and both of these spheres from the rest of life. So what should one expect of endless meetings, plenums, summits, protocols, voting? Nothing. One cannot expect a democratic vote, even in the midst of the most democratic and inclusive of summits, to end climate change. One might as well believe in fairy tales, which is, after all democracy is. Calls for climate justice ignores the root of the problem if its demands are made in terms of rights granted to individuals via the state. The concept of climate justice advocated by NGOs and activists has little to do with the irreversible historical tragedy visited upon vast swaths of the world by Western colonialism, which no technology transfer, the forcing of giant centralized energy production, or ecological reparations, pretending the cost of colonialism can be given a monetary price, can possibly redeem. On its current terrain, just transition concerns itself solely with ensuring that proletarians remain proletarians, swapping the carbon factory floor of the present for the windmill farm of the future. By failing to address by whose agency a meaningful just transition will be achieved, just transition activists only help maintain the management of the work and production. Moreover, it postpones the inevitable conclusion, namely that we are all fucked by geological degradation at this moment, and there's no room anymore for such pleasant illusions as justice, just as there is no room for bourgeoisie comfort. The reality of the situation is that swaths of working-class Americans and Western Europeans will have to make do with the same material resources of Africans. The state makes empty promises of clean development and even climate justice, knowing true and well the reality of the nightmarish politics of scarce resources the world is entering. What is needed is not the mystification of social justice, but a realization of our position within the global social war. Not the question of justice, but of vengeance. A million tricks, anything and everything except the abolishment of capitalism in the state, will be played to delay the inevitable insurrection. What if the workers could decide democratically what to produce and what to consume, adhering to the most strict of carbon-setting principles? This paradise of radical Democrats, who so loved Argentina, would not solve anything. One needs only to look at the network of ecological cooperatives that are now just SULs, corporate enterprises. As witnessed by cooperatives like Mondragon, the cooperative today is the most advanced form of self-managed enslavement, as the worker is supposed to identify with the cooperative more than with the rest of the working class. When everyone becomes a little bit of a manager, how can one not have some sympathy for the boss, who is just another worker in the same cooperative? How could you go on strike? Don't unionize, don't rebel. If you have any problems, you can just talk to me. After all, I'm not really the boss, I'm just another human being. One cannot expect capitalism, even cooperatively managed, to produce anything other than the ecological devastation. As the accumulation of dead capital from the living world is built into its dynamics. In a world of ever-rising unemployment, where it is production itself that is causing ecological degradation, it is the concept of work that is itself superfluous. The best we can hope for is another sentimental education. Even the most radical Democrats must see their hopes dashed as capitalism betrays them again and again. Defeated protest after defeated protest, useless treaty after useless treaty. Perhaps at some point even activists will surrender hope that capitalism and the state can cure catastrophic climate change. The poor, the working class, the indigenous, and others know the illusion of development, sustainable and otherwise, is gone. The only option, as pioneered by the workers in Bangladesh who burnt down their factories to the youth in France who burnt down their libraries, is the destruction of their identity as workers under capitalism. To want absolutely nothing from capital and the state except its abolition by our own hands. A zero-carbon world is possible, but not an authoritarian nightmare imposed from above by democratic capitalism, but one created and self-organized from below. We do not have 40 years for this sentimental education, for as a species we are running out of time to halt the biocrisis. If possible, this sentimental education must be accelerated. The managers and architects of the movement, the NGOs and all of civil society, the moralistic social democrats masquerading as anarchists, are only the experimental ground for the state to perfect its methods of governance. The point is not to perfect the state. The point is to destroy it.